Hello, everybody. This is Kyle. I will be leading your webinar today. Hopefully everyone is excited to learn about some different GP issues. All right, so to start off with, and we'll try not to jump all over the place, but there's definitely a wide variety of topics we'll be covering. So hopefully you're able to follow along, and if you find that something might not quite apply to you, then feel free to disregard or just keep it in your back pocket for something that might come up. So the first thing I want to talk about that we commonly see are just kind of general issues with distributions on transactions. So regardless of the module that you're working in GP, whenever you create a transaction, the system is going to automatically pull in different general ledger accounts based on the way that you have your system set up. And a lot of times we'll get questions on either why isn't an account coming in when I expect it to, or you might even end up with an error message that says, hey, you're not using the right distribution types to match up with the account that you're processing. So just a couple of things that can help you, that you can check out when you come across those sort of issues. So I'm going to jump into a payables transaction entry, and then I actually have a couple of transactions here that I've been working with. So this first one here, what we're dealing with is we've got a payables invoice that we've set up, and this invoice is going to have a freight charge assigned to it. And so when I enter this transaction for $500 with a $10 freight charge, the system's automatically going to recognize that I need to send that $10 for freight to a separate general ledger account. So, maybe I just enter that in, assume everything is good, and try to post, and I'm going to get an error message that says, hey, you're missing a freight distribution. If I actually go into my distributions window here, and you can see that I've got this line here for a freight transaction, but there's no account there. So this is kind of an example of how GP would pull in those accounts. When we're dealing with vendors, the first place that it's going to look is at the vendor itself. So if I go back to my transaction screen, you can actually see when I try to close out a distributions, it tells me you've got an error, there's no account specified. So what I want to do is drill back on my vendor here, go into vendor maintenance, and then in vendor maintenance under the accounts section, these are all of the default accounts that are associated with this vendor. So you can see here, I don't have a freight account assigned on this vendor. So this is the first place that GP is going to look when it's trying to determine what account that freight should go to. So I can fill in this account here, and then when I enter that transaction, it would populate with that account. But you might also say, well, I don't have a freight account assigned on any of my vendors, but I still get that freight account coming in. The next place that the system looks is actually at the company level setup. You can define a default account for freight or any of the distribution types on for the whole company. And so for that we actually have to go into the company or the posting setup. So from the main GP dropdown, we go to Tools, Setup, Posting, and then Posting Accounts. And so this is actually for the entire, all the subledgers within GP. Everything has got a default account here. If I narrow this down to just display my purchasing accounts, you can see conveniently I don't have a freight account there because I came in and removed it for this example. But if I were to fill in something there, I'm just going to grab a random account right now because I'm not sure what it would be. So we'll just grab, and again, this is just for example, that's probably not the right account to use, but I'm just going to grab it here. So I'm going to fill in that freight account so that it's got one there, and go ahead and click OK. Now if I go back to my payables transaction here, go back into the distributions, I can go ahead and click on this default button. What this button does is it tells GP to automatically go back through the logic and determine what account should be used based on the current setup. So it might have been at the time of entering this transaction, I didn't have all those accounts set up properly. Now that I do, I can come in and tell it to default. It's going to say this is going to reset it to the default, so you're sure you want to do this. Go ahead and click change. Now it pulls in that freight account that I set up from the posting setup, and there it is. That default button can also help if you've been, fiddling with the distributions, changing amounts and accounts, splitting things up, and you realize that it's not what you want. Click on that default button, and that just tells GP, go back through your core logic, what would you expect the posting accounts to be, and it's going to fill those in. So now that I have that filled in, I can click OK. My transaction's good. I won't get any distribution errors when I try to post that transaction. I'm going to go ahead and save that one. The other scenario that I commonly see with payables transactions especially is if you're doing a transaction here where you're actually entering a check, what's called on the fly. So rather than entering the invoice, posting it, and then doing the select checks process, I just entered a $200 check right in here and assigned a check number so that I can just quickly print a check right when I'm entering this invoice. What happens in this scenario is that normally with your payables transaction, your invoice would hit your accounts payable account and then your accrued purchases account, and then when you go and do the check, that would offset the purchasing account and then, or excuse me, the payables account and then go to cash. If we're combining those two transactions together, GP is only expecting to see the purchasing account and then the cash account as our distributions. So if I go into our distribution now, I might be thinking that, hey, this is just an invoice, so I should be using our purchases account and our accounts payable account. But if I try to actually post this, the system's going to say, well, no, you're doing an invoice and a check together, so you should only have the purchases account and the cash account. So again, if I click OK, it's going to tell me distribution transaction contains errors. It's saying the accounts payable distribution does not equal actual amount, and the cash distribution does not equal the actual amount. So again, I would just go into my distributions window and go ahead and hit this default button. It's going to tell GP to go back through the logic and bring in what it would expect accounts to be. And so there you can see it took my accrued purchases account, and then it offset that with the cash account. So assuming that you enter everything, through the front end or through the main window, these should come in correctly. But just be aware of that. If you ever, try changing those distributions, it can cause issues and errors when you're doing this on-the-fly check processing. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with distributions. Again, that applies to any subledger. So even if you're doing purchase order processing, receivables, invoices, cash receipts, everything's got those default accounts that are set up either through the customer, through the item, all those different places. So just be aware if you ever run into those distribution errors, it often means that you're just missing a piece of that setup, and so you might have to review, that customer, that vendor, that item to figure out what account is missing. All right, so then another couple things that I would commonly come across dealing with payables is during the select checks process. One thing that can happen, let me actually, here, I'll do just right into the select check. So I've got a batch here that I want to do. So I'm going to do this credit batch, and I want to do just my vendor credits here. So I've entered in an invoice for this vendor. I believe it was for $200. I can't quite remember. But if I go ahead and build this batch and let the system populate it was for $100 then. I can see that my batch total comes in at only $75. And so that might seem out of place. Well, the reason that that's happening here is because down here in my setup options, I have it marked to automatically apply existing unapplied payments, credit memos, and returns. So what I probably didn't realize with this vendor is I actually have a $25 credit that was issued for this vendor. So I've got that out there, not applied to anything. And then I also have my $100 invoice. So with those options marked, the system is automatically going to apply that $25 credit. And so the net check that the system's going to try to generate is just $75. I've definitely seen scenarios where that kind of catches people off guard, where they say, well, I just want to pay that full $100 invoice and I'm going to use the credit for something else, or maybe it should have been applied to a different transaction that hasn't been entered yet, things like that. So that's just one of the things to kind of keep an eye out for. If you have these options marked, it's going to automatically apply anything that's outstanding. If you find that you don't want that to happen, you just need to remove your batch and rebuild it without these options marked. So keep an eye out for something like that. Another area with the payables checks processing that we'll often see, I'm just going to kind of continue with this batch and go ahead and do my print checks process. So you come into the print checks window, go ahead and you print your checks. Pretty standard here. I'm just going to send them to the screen. Here's my check. Okay, that looks great. Someone comes into your office and you get distracted. So during that time, you go through and you just kind of start closing out of windows and you remember, oh wait, I still need to go and post those checks. Usually the post checks window comes up automatically, but if it doesn't, you can actually just pick up that process right where you left off. Just come down to the post checks window. So you should be able to select the batch right here. So I can see there's my credit check batch. It's got this status of check printing. So that's always the key indicator that you just need to complete that posting process for the checks. A lot of times you might see that there's a check out there, but you can't find it. You're not sure where it is. If you come into the batches window and try to pull up that batch, there's my credit batch. It's got that status of check printing. That's the indicator that I need to go into the post checks window and complete the posting process. Similarly, I can go into the post checks window, and since I haven't actually posted it yet, I can come and reprint the checks. And this is kind of goes hand in hand with another just best practice that I always recommend is anytime that you're printing checks, hold off on this post checks process until you're absolutely sure all the checks are correct. So take a couple minutes, review all the checks that you printed out, make sure everything looks good, the amounts are correct, because once we go and post those checks, it's a lot more difficult to go and void them out and reprocess them than it is to either void them here ahead of time or reprint them. Maybe your printer ran out of ink halfway through printing, or it got onto the wrong check number. It's a lot easier to reprint those checks from right in this window rather than after the fact having to void out all those checks and try reprinting them again with the same numbers. So, it's taking the extra couple minutes now can alleviate a lot of pain later on. The other thing that you might see, and I don't have an example for this one, but sometimes you might post your checks, but then they still aren't completed. You might see a batch that has a status of remittance processing. So either if you have a check that had too many invoices to where it wouldn't fit on a check stub, or you might be generating a remittance for the whole batch based on your settings when you went and built the check batch. There's this additional window for process remittance. So sometimes after you try to post, you might see a batch that's in that remittance processing status. That just means you need to come into this window, select the batch, print your remittance forms if it's eligible, or sometimes you just don't care about the remittance and you just want to post. So that's where, if you see a batch stuck in that status, you'd want to come into this window and try to post it. All right. So another area that I want to talk about, and it's probably something that you might have run into, in the past month, especially with the end of the year process, is 1099s in dealing with vendors. GP has added a really good utility in the past few years to help fix issues with 1099s, and that is the edit 1099 transaction information. down here under purchasing and transactions. What this actually allows you to do is go in and review all of the transactions that existed for a vendor throughout the year. And if they, for some reason, weren't set as a 1099 transaction when they were created, or maybe they were set as a 1099 and they shouldn't have been, you can go in and edit the 1099 status of each individual transaction for that vendor. So for example, I'm just going to pull up one here, and I can see he had 2 transactions that were both assigned to box 7 of the 1099, and maybe I realized after the fact that I had set this person up as a 1099 vendor, but they shouldn't have been. I can come into this Edit 1099 window and just change these to not a 1099 transaction. And then the system, once I process, will go through and update that transaction status, remove that dollar amount from the vendor's 1099 total for the year, so that it's not showing up on their 1099 when I try to print those. So this window is really great for making those sort of edits. One thing to be aware of is if you go onto the vendor card and change their 1099 status there, so say you found a vendor that was a 1099 that shouldn't have been, you want to make sure that you leave them as a 1099 vendor, go and make changes to the transactions first, and then change that status on the vendor card. Otherwise, you won't be able to pull them up in this window, so then you wouldn't be able to change those transactions. But that's going to be, your best tool overall for correcting or making changes to vendor 1099 amounts. All right, so I'm just going to process this here so we can see exactly what it looks like. It's pretty straightforward and kind of does everything in the background, but it just shows, what transactions you're editing, changing them to not a 1099 type when they were box 7. Everything's good to go then. So now if I go into that vendor's 1099 total and go back to 2017, I can see that they do not, they must have had another transaction in there that's showing up, but we didn't really check this before to see what it was, so I apologize that might not be clear, but it would have taken those amounts out of the ones that we just changed. So, is there a question or no? Okay. Okay. So, and we did have one question that had come in prior to the meeting here about transactions on the historical age trial balance that are showing up. They show as paid, but when they run that historical age trial balance, it's still showing up as an outstanding document. And this can kind of apply to both payables and receivables. I think it's more common on the receivable side to see something like this. So I'm going to focus there, but just know that very similar things can come up on the payable side. So with the receivables historical age trial balance, the biggest thing to remember is that this report is looking at the information at a specific point in time. So right now I've got this report set up to run as of February 1st, 2018. And what we should see if I print this report, that's the multi-currency one that I don't want. Oh, excuse me, this is a summary. I want to print it. Yeah, it should be printing in detail. Okay, well, so what I'm seeing is I do have this amount outstanding in my current bucket for $13.37. So if I actually, for this vendor, or excuse me, this customer, oh, this is summary for all of them. It's not showing. So I've got this customer set up the hat beat test. So let's go and look at the transactions for that customer so we can see kind of what's going on. So we can see here I've got an invoice out there from January 15th, and then the payment was made on January 31st. But when I run that historical age trial balance as of February 1st, I'm still seeing that dollar amount showing as outstanding. And the thing to really be aware about with the historical age trial balance is it's always running based on the date that the transaction was applied. So even though both of these transactions fall before that February 1st date that I was running, if I go and look at the payment transaction and drill back on the amount remaining, I can actually see that they were applied on February 2nd. So now it's probably, from a business logic perspective, not a lot of reason that that would happen, but I have seen scenarios where that apply date does get changed during the application process, and so that can really affect what shows up on that trial balance. Otherwise, just be aware of if you're running that date or that trial balance with the date in between when the invoice was issued and when the payment was received, that invoice is obviously going to still show as outstanding. So it's really important when you come across those kind of issues where you've got something showing up on the trial balance that you don't think should, pay close attention to those dates and also the total dollar amount applied. Sometimes if it's like a partial application or maybe that invoice isn't actually fully paid, it can still show on that trial balance report. And I know that's kind of just general information, and it's hard to know if that's going to apply to a specific scenario that you might come across, but those are the key areas to really look at, is the dates of the original transaction, the dates that you're running the trial balance report, and then keep an eye on some of those options that are used as well, as far as showing fully applied and outstanding amounts. So another thing that can help with some issues dealing with receivables transactions primarily, if you ever notice that there's an issue with like this amount remaining on the transaction, so say for example my invoice was showing at a dollar amount of $13.37 and my amount remaining was still showing $10 available or remaining. If I were to drill back on that and see that this full apply amount or the payment was for the full apply amount, one thing I can do to help correct that and kind of update this apply record based on what's actually out there would be under the utility section, there's the reconcile tool. And reconcile is available in all modules, and it kind of does a different thing depending upon what module you're in. But this is one of the common ones that I'll see. You can come and reconcile the outstanding document amounts for a customer, and what that does is it compares the transaction headers and what's available or what's remaining on that transaction versus what's actually been applied to it. And if there's a discrepancy there, it's going to fix that on the transaction header so that an apply amount goes to the correct total. And one reason that can be really important is that when you run your paid transaction removal to determine which transaction should go to history, the system is looking at that amount remaining. And if that amount remaining isn't zero, even though it's got transactions fully applied to it for the total dollar amount, it wouldn't move into history. So that can be one of the reasons why it might not move into history. And so running this outstanding document amount reconcile can help fix that. So kind of keep that one in your back pocket, and if you ever have questions about what each of these does or which one would be the best to use, which option, you can always reach out to us, or we do have a blog post out on our website that talks about the reconcile utility and what it does in each module. So keep that in mind if you ever run into those issues where the summary information doesn't quite look the same as what the detail should. All right. so one other topic that I'll quickly talk about, it's kind of a general topic, but it can apply to, payables and receivables before we kind of move into some other modules, is dealing with transaction dates. It's not uncommon for either a data entry error or, something to change after the fact where the date was entered wrong. Either, the day was wrong, month was wrong, whatever it may be. Unfortunately, there's not a easy way to just change that on a transaction once it's been posted. So say you enter an invoice with, you accidentally put March 14th instead of February 14th. There's no way to just change that transaction to be back in February. What we need to look at doing is just voiding that transaction and then re-entering it with the correct date. And you should be able to use the same document number and everything in most scenarios. The same applies for checks if they're ever printed with the wrong date. We really just want to look at voiding those out and re-entering them with the correct date. Similarly, if you're working with a bank transaction or even a general ledger entry, canceling or reversing that entry and re-entering it is going to be the best option. There are some ways to do it through the back end to be able to kind of update that information if it's a scenario where it wouldn't be feasible to void a transaction, or you had a batch of 200 transactions that all have the wrong date. If you contact us here at DFC, we can do some work in the back end to kind of fix that and help make things easier without having to void everything in the front end. But in general, the best practice is to void those through the front end and re-enter them with the correct date. All right, so I've got a couple of things that we can talk about in the payroll module that I see come up every once in a while. So one of the tricky things that can happen is you set up a new deduction in the system or even a new benefit code. You started using a new health insurance plan and you've got those set up. Or maybe an employee has a new garnishment that they just are now starting. And you go and run your payroll, build checks, calculate checks, and you're not seeing that deduction come out at all. So there's a few different areas that we'd want to look at to verify that everything's set up correctly so that that deduction would be ready to go. So the first place to look is at the deduction code itself. So if you go into deduction maintenance, obviously you'd pull up the employee and the specific code you're dealing with. The first place to look is this start date field. So as long as this start date is within the pay period that you're running, then that deduction would be eligible to come out. So just be aware of that can affect it. The other thing to look at is this checkbox for transaction required. It's usually if you're marking that, you're familiar with the functionality, but just to be aware that that means that the deduction isn't going to happen automatically. It's going to require you to enter a transaction through payroll transaction entry in order for that deduction to come out. This functionality can be really helpful if you're going to have a deduction that changes week to week, or maybe it's, like a meal plan deduction or something that's where the amount changes based on how much the employee utilized. So you can do that transaction required where you have to actually go in and set the amount each week. But just be aware if you have that marked, it's not going to automatically come out through your normal deduction process. The other area that can affect usually not new deductions, but maybe an older one, is if you ever set a maximum amount on the deduction, that'll actually stop it from automatically processing if that maximum has been met. So there's a pay period maximum amount, which will really only apply if you're doing your deduction as like a % of wages and you want to stop at a certain amount. So say I want to take 5% of their wages up to a maximum of $25. You can set that pay period maximum and that's fine. But if you ever set a calendar year maximum or a lifetime maximum, the system is going to go and look at the summary information for that deduction and that employee and see has that employee met that maximum for either the specific calendar year or for their lifetime. If it has, that deduction is not going to come out. So that's another place that I've seen people get tripped up is that, they maybe set a lifetime maximum at some point, and now they're using that same deduction code again. If that maximum's on there, it's not going to allow that deduction to keep going. So those are 3 areas right in the deduction maintenance that you want to keep your eyes open for. The other area that sometimes gets people, especially with new deductions that are added, is when you go to your payroll build, if you have a default ID that you use on a regular basis, make sure that you check out your include deductions window, and either you have all selected, or if you're only doing specific ones, make sure you include that new deduction code in your selected deductions. So sometimes it's just that little thing that gets missed and causes that deduction to not come out. Same process with benefits. If you set up a new benefit, make sure that it's included in the build here. So then one other thing that I commonly see with the payroll processing is that you might come up with an error that says, maybe they're not getting any state tax withheld, or it'll say state tax record is missing for this employee. So there's a couple different places that you have to set up that state tax information. So first of all, under cards and state tax, you want to make sure that you have for the employee, you have a state tax record assigned for them. So for example, here with my employee, I've got a Wisconsin state tax set up. I've filled in their filing status, any exemptions, if they have additional withholding. You need to have this record set up so that the system knows this employee can have Wisconsin state tax taken. But then what happens is on the individual payroll transactions, we actually have to assign that specific state to each transaction. Normally, that would come in by default based on the way the employee's tax information is set up. But sometimes if you don't catch that right away, you might start entering transactions and it won't have that state tax associated with the transaction. So in that case, you'd need to come into the employee tax maintenance window and make sure that here under your transaction entry defaults, you have that specific state tax assigned. So then this is going to tell the system when I create a new transaction for this employee, automatically assign Wisconsin as the eligible state tax for that transaction. If this is something that you don't have set up initially, you go and enter in payroll transactions for the week, and then you realize that that's missing, just know that setting this here in the tax maintenance window will not retroactively apply to any transactions that are already in the system. So if you go and assign this after the fact, you'll have to go back into each of your payroll transactions and either delete them for the employee and re-add them so that it picks up that default setting, or you can manually set that state tax on the transaction. You would just pull open that window. Let me see if I have a batch here I can look at real quick. So if you select that transaction and then choose to show details, you can see here there's the state that's assigned. So you would just have to fill that in for the employee's transaction. Those are probably the 2 biggest things that I see with the payroll process, and little things that can catch you or trip you up as you're going through that process. Okay. So then the other main area that we might see issues would be on the general ledger. A couple of things to be aware of in here. One thing to look at is sometimes you might be reviewing your transaction summary information. So an account summary. So you pull up an account. Let me see if I can find one with data real quick. There we go. So you pull up an account and you're reviewing the balances right here in the summary inquiry, and maybe you notice that between the debit and credit totals, you go and look at the individual transactions, and that amount isn't quite adding up to the net change. Or even in some scenarios, maybe you're just missing the summary information. I've seen a couple places where like after processing the year-end close or doing some other database maintenance, this summary information sometimes just goes away, which is very uncommon, but there are tools to help fix that. Here we're just looking to do the reconcile utility again. So with financials, the options for reconcile are pretty straightforward. You come under utilities and reconcile, and the most common one you're going to do is the reconcile year. You want to do and just click reconcile. And again, what the system does is it goes and looks at all of the individual transactions for each account, totals them all up, and then sets that as the summary balance. Occasionally, if there's an interruption during posting, maybe the transaction went through just fine, but it never updated the summary balance on the account, or something just got out of line. So that's where you'll use this reconcile function to fix that. It's also important to note, on some of your reports, they may be referencing that summary information for the accounts. So if you notice things that are wrong there, use the reconcile tool to help you correct those. The other area then, so we kind of talked about, doing corrections or fixing date issues. Sometimes you might find that maybe if the date on a transaction was entered wrong, but not as important that you fix it in the subledger. So like in payables, it's fine to exist how it is, but you really need to make sure that it goes to the correct periods on the general ledger. You can actually use the correcting tool built into the general ledger to be able to back out and then repost a general ledger transaction. Typically, you don't want to do that for a transaction that was generated from a subledger, but there are scenarios where it might be reasonable to do that, and you do have that option. So if you go into your transaction entry window, there's the correct button up at the top. You can click that, and then you have the options to either just back out a journal entry, which is just reverse it, do the exact opposite, or you can choose to back out a journal entry and create a correcting entry. So that's going to have the system automatically generate the back out entry that reverses it, and then it's going to automatically generate a new correcting entry where you can make changes to either the date, maybe it went to the wrong accounts, or the dollar amounts weren't quite right. You can make all of those changes, and the system automatically then creates kind of the audit trail for that back out and correcting entry. You just have to know the journal entry number of the specific one you want to correct. I'm just going to grab a random one here as an example, but we won't actually post anything. So I'm just going to click OK, and here you can see it automatically populated my back out entry for that journal entry. So this would be the exact opposite. Debits are now credits, credits are now debits, etc. So I can, this one I want to just leave exactly the same because I want to back it out exactly as it was. And then the correcting entry that's generated is the exact same as the original entry, and this is where I can make changes. So say that my date was wrong, I can change that date. Maybe I need to go back a month. Maybe one of my accounts was incorrect, so I can change that account. Any of those changes that you want to make for the correct version of the journal entry, you can do that here, and then you can post that as well. So again, you can do that on entries that originate from a subledger or just any entries that you find out there, and the system creates that audit trail where it says we're backing out this journal entry, we're correcting this journal entry. You can follow all of that through as you need to. And I'm going to go ahead and just cancel my posting journals since we don't really need to see those. I think that covers most of what I had. There was one other question that was emailed in that we can quickly talk about. Someone had mentioned that they had a disruption or an interruption when they were processing a sales invoice, and it kind of locked up. Now when they go to try to print new invoices, it keeps printing that one that was locked up along with that same one as before. This is kind of a unique scenario that I haven't I don't encounter on a regular basis, and I definitely would want to dig into a little bit more of what's going on for that specific transaction. My initial thoughts are that we'd want to possibly look at running what's called the checklinks maintenance routine. So checklinks is a built-in tool within GP where it goes and validates data and looks for fragmented data or transactions that are referenced in one area but not in another when they should be in both. I always give the caveat that you really don't want to run checklinks unless you're certain that you're trying to fix a specific issue. Well, it is kind of a general maintenance routine. It does make changes without any sort of prompt or review. So sometimes, even though it's correcting data, it sometimes causes more issues than it fixes, just because of the way that it kind of brute forces the corrections through. So just be aware, at the very least, make sure you take a backup of your database and process anything that you do in checklinks after hours, just because it is also very resource intensive and it can take a long time depending upon what area of the system you're running checklinks for. But just to look at that really quick, that's under maintenance and then checklinks. Basically, every module has its own series of checklinks routines that you can run. So financial, sales, purchasing, all the way on down. And then once you get into there, you actually choose what area you want to run checklinks for. So if you're dealing with invoices, and this is specifically for the invoicing module, you'd likely want to do invoice. I think in this scenario that was explicitly mentioned, I'd probably do it for the invoice work, because it sounds like there's something in the work processing tables that's stuck and keeps referencing that old invoice. So that would likely be where I start. But you insert those. It'll tell you approximately how many records. This one's pretty small, but for example, if I were to look at like receivables open transactions, well, and I think my demo data is relatively small overall. But yeah, so here's like sales history. Just in my demo data, I have 2,700 transactions. If you start getting hundreds of thousands of transactions, this process is going to take a long time to run. So that's where we recommend doing it after hours. But you just select those tables and click OK. The system goes through a process and it will give you a report that says, here's the errors that we found, here's what we did to fix it. So again, there's no review stage or anything like that. It just says, hey, I think this is broken, here's what I did to fix it. So just you want to be aware, it's going to push those changes through regardless. But this can be a good tool to run if you think that there is some fragmented data out there. So I just kind of wanted to mention that, since I know that was one of the questions that had potentially come in beforehand. Otherwise, I don't really have any other areas that I wanted to touch on right now, but definitely want to open the floor to either any questions on things that we talked about, or maybe something popped into your mind of an issue that you've come across recently that you want to quickly discuss. So we can kind of open it up if you just want to either type in chat that you have a question, or we could look at unmuting or anything like that. Anything, Sabrina? Okay. Well, obviously, if you do come across a specific scenario, or maybe something jumps into your mind later today as you're thinking about all the awesome stuff that you learned, you certainly can reach out to us. Give us a call, 701-281-6112, or you can always email us, support@dfcconsultants.com, and we'll be happy to help answer any questions or help fix any issues. We will have a recording of this available, so if you want to be able to review, Sabrina will email that out to everyone in attendance today. So, otherwise, if there are no other questions, that'll wrap everything up. I appreciate everyone's time, and again, if you come across anything else, certainly let us know.